Hello and welcome to another video from the English at Penrice YouTube channel. Today we are going to be exploring the character of Eva Smith from J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Called. If you're thinking about your exam, this is going to be particularly helpful for your English literature, paper 2, section A. Okay, let's start by having a look at some key information about this character. So Eva Smith is at the centre of the plot of the play. Her suicide as a result of drinking bleach follows a chain of events involving the Burlings in which Eva is involved and becomes increasingly more desperate, isolated, and she feels hopeless. It's the reason for the inspector's arrival at the Burlings' house, and the inspector is eager to morally, rather than legally, inspect the Burlings' actions in order to gain justice for Eva. So Eva is sacked by Mr. Burling from the factory after she helps to organise a strike. Unfortunately, then she is fired from Millward's as a result of Sheila becoming jealous of her and enraged when she thinks that Eva has been smirking and giggling about a dress that she's wearing. Sheila threatens to close her account, which would be a rather significant threat from a daughter of a very wealthy family, and so the manager asks Eva to leave that second job. She then turns, we assume, to consider a life of prostitution. However, before that happens, she meets Gerald at the Palace Bar, and she's offered a place to stay and some financial help from Gerald. He then ends his relationship with Eva when he goes away on business. Then she meets Eric Burling. She engages in a relationship with him that ultimately ends with her becoming pregnant. He attempts to financially support her, but is stealing money from his father's business in order to do so. She believes that's immoral, so when she finds out that the money is stolen, she refuses to take any more. She approaches then finally Mrs. Burling's charity, at first attempting to conceal the fact that she is unmarried, as she realises that will result in the women being prejudiced against her, and then telling them that she is unmarried and she wanted to refuse any stolen money. Unfortunately, Mrs. Burling turns Eva away, is prejudiced against her case from the outset because Eva decides to use Mrs. Burling's name, potentially simply because she was in a relationship with Eric Burling prior to this. And then she feels utterly desperate and hopeless, and she takes her own life. So it's really important that we realise that we don't actually hear directly from Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton as she is known by some in the play. She doesn't have a voice. Rather, we are told about her through the other characters, and that's really important because Priestley has constructed this character to represent those working class women and the broader working class in the Edwardian era who were undervalued, struggling, living in poverty, and didn't have a voice, were not able to share their opinion or make a change in society because of the lack of power and status that they had. And she represents those, and the fact that we don't hear directly from her is very important. Let's have a look at some important quotes that you can use to enhance your analysis of this character and support your ideas. So despite not hearing directly from her, despite her not talking directly to us as an audience or to the other characters, we hear a lot about her from the inspector and the other Burling members of the Burling family. So the first important quote that we're going to have a look at is that first one there. Burnt her inside out, of course. She was in great agony. That's really gruesome imagery to describe a young girl taking her own life, and that's said by the inspector. That's really used to highlight how awful, how terrible and shocking the end of Eva Smith's life was, and how the struggle for the working class and their desperation led her to such a terrible end. It also needs to be noted that the inspector's perhaps trying to suggest that this horrifying end to somebody so vulnerable is the consequence of the thoughtless and immoral actions of people in society like the Burlings, who offer the working class no support and no equality. And then Mr. Burling describes her as having far too much to say. She had a lot to say, far too much, so she had to go. So we get the impression that, she's a rather independent woman. She appreciates the struggles of her fellow workers, and she attempts to do something about it. She attempts to stand up to the inequality and the unjust way the society is organised in the Edwardian era. And she attempts to organise the strike that would hopefully result in a rise to her wages. Unfortunately, due to her being working class, and especially perhaps a working class female, she is seen to be out of place in this, and she is fired as a result. It's rather ironic that Mr. Burling says she has far too much to say, because he is one of the most verbose characters in the play. The third quote, a nice little promising life there, and a nasty mess somebody's made of it. So we've got that juxtaposition of the nice promising life that Eva had. She's a lively, energetic girl, we know, potential to work hard and progress in life, but because of the unjust nature of Edwardian society and the taking advantage of power of people like the Burlings, there's the nasty mess is the result and the end of her life in a horrifying way. The fourth quote, no relatives to help her, few friends, lonely, half-starved, she was feeling desperate. So we've got these adjectives here, lonely, half-starved, desperate, which shows the struggle of her as a working class woman, with nobody to rely on, little support, malnourished as a result of the meagre wages she receives from Mr. Burling, allowing her no savings to cover her outgoings when she was fired from her jobs. Desperate suggests the urgency that with which she needed that support, and the callousness with which she was turned away. Then we have a quote, and this adjective pretty is used by lots of the characters actually in the play. And it's been suggested that it's used for a number of reasons, maybe to highlight her youth and her vulnerability, and how horrifying that it was that she took her life in such a way to end in such agony. Also, maybe Priestley wants us to realise how similar she perhaps was with Sheila in some ways, a young woman, a whole life ahead of her, lively and charismatic. However, the treatment of the working class females in the Edwardian era meant that her life developed in a very, very different way and a much more horrifying way. And then again, we have this list. She was alone, friendless, almost penniless, desperate. And that repetition of desperate is really, really important from earlier in the play. Her life is a struggle as a working class female, and she never seems to get the support that she needs in order to live a life of comfort, and she's never free from her worries and her anxieties. Penniless as well, this idea of bringing it back to the finances, that juxtaposes with the Burlings' life of affluence and luxury, and this idea of her being alone is very emotive. She had no one to turn to, and the person she does turn to at the end, Mrs. Burling, rejects her. Then we have Mrs. Burling's exclamative here, as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. That's a really interesting quote, and it shows how females of the working class were viewed by people like Mrs. Burling, a member of the upper class, as if the working class females were immoral and unable to act in an honourable and principled way. Of course, to the audience, that seems ridiculous, because Eva does, in organising the strike, act in a principled way to try to help herself, but also other workers at the factory. We know that she is moral in her rejection of stolen money from Eric. And so that upper class refusal to appreciate the moral, compassionate behaviour of the working classes is quite callous and thoughtless. And Mrs. Burling becomes more unlikable as a result, and we definitely feel a lot more sympathy for Eva. And then this final quote, in the inspector's final rhetorical speech, he tells us that one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. So through this quote, we know that Eva Smith is a symbol. She represents the struggling working classes of the Edwardian era, and the repetition of millions and millions, that shows that there are a huge amount of people in the Edwardian era suffering the same fate, potentially, as Eva, a life of struggle and destitution. Finally, let's have a look at some sophisticated vocabulary that you can use to really enhance your analysis of this character. So, first of all, Eva's very strong-willed at the start of the play, when we hear about her during Mr. Burling's interrogation. She's determined to fight for a fairer wage for her and her fellow employees. Unfortunately, that will is broken down by the thoughtless, immoral actions of the Burling family. She's also, we get the impression, a dynamic young woman before her interactions with the Burlings. She's very energetic and lively, and has lots of potential to achieve well in life. However, because of the actions of the Burlings, she becomes destitute and impoverished, which means she has very, very little money, hardly enough to live by. She lives in poverty, barely enough to find any money to allow her to eat or to have a safe roof over her head. The adjective disenfranchised means that she didn't have the right to vote, so she doesn't have a voice, she doesn't have the ability to change anything, because she isn't given the power to as a working class female. And thus she is, or could be described as disregarded, so her views and her opinions and her as a person are pushed to one side and ignored. She's mistreated by the Burling family, so the way they treat her is immoral and thoughtless, and ends in her death. We could also say that she's voiceless, not only physically in the play, we don't hear directly from her, but also not being able to have the voice that is needed to change the unjust treatment of the working class. She's very vulnerable, so she's at risk of exploitation. The Burling family take advantage of their power over her, and she is vulnerable to their treatment. She is powerless, but then finally we do come to realise that she's virtuous, so she's honourable, and she does turn down the stolen money that Eric offers her. But unfortunately, she is spurned, so she's turned away quite harshly. So to spurn somebody means to reject them, to turn them away. And Mrs. Burling does that, as well as the other Burlings, during her meeting with the Charity Commission. Okay, that was a video exploring the character of Eva Smith from An Inspector Calls. Do subscribe to the channel for more videos for English literature and language.